This is not an attack on politics. It is an examination of us, our appetites, our incentives, our attention, and the kind of leaders those forces reward. We live in an age that confuses performance with responsibility. The stage is crowded, the spotlight is hungry, and the metrics that decide who rises, clicks, clips, polls, donor heat, tell us more about spectacle than substance. If we want different outcomes, we have to look not only at the characters striding across the platform, but at the architecture of the platform itself. The incentives, the stories, the fears and fatigues that shape our choices. The rise of false leaders is less a mystery of personality than a mirror of culture. The misread Machiavelli. Machiavelli is easy to caricature and hard to read honestly. For many, the Prince is a handbook of cruelty, the patron text of the manipulator. Yet read alongside the discourses, a different figure emerges, not a cheerleader for barbarism, but a sober diagnostician of power. He did not celebrate vice, he refused to disguise it. He wrote not to seduce the reader into cynicism, but to strip away the pretty lies by which republics are lulled to sleep. What Machiavelli insists on, above all, is clarity. See the incentives, see the theater, see how reputation moves crowds and how fear can be minted into obedience. He takes the romance out of rule and the mystique out of rulers. The provocation is not be ruthless, but refuse illusion. A polity that cannot look directly at its appetites will be governed by those willing to exploit them. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of his work, and it is precisely why his lens belongs to this era. The modern reader often mistakes clarity for cruelty because clarity costs comfort. It is easier to condemn Machiavelli than to admit how readily we trade reality for narrative and narrative for brand. But clarity is not the enemy of ethics, it is its precondition. Without a hard view of how power is sought, kept, and defended, moral language collapses into performance. The first task of civic maturity is to prefer the difficult truth to the flattering story, and Machiavelli's value is that he denies us the anesthetic of flattering stories. Seen this way, his writing becomes a civic instrument. It helps citizens protect themselves from the charms of charisma and the hypnosis of crisis. It reminds rulers that means corrode ends, that legitimacy is tinder, that fortune is fickle. It warns everyone that institutions are easier to burn than to build, and that the flames look heroic only to those far from the heat. The lesson is not to admire the fox and the lion, but to recognize them, and to keep them in cages built of law, norm, and accountability. This matters now because our culture has drifted toward a politics of costume. The cape is mistaken for courage, the slogan for strategy, the viral clip for competence. Machiavelli, read carefully, refuses the costume. He demands we inspect the seams. He teaches that the health of a republic is measured less by the height of its leader than by the strength of its institutions and the seriousness of its citizens. If we misread him, we give ourselves permission to misread our moment. If we read him honestly, we regain the tools to name what we are seeing, without theatrics, without panic, and without the self-deception that makes false leaders inevitable. Narcissism as a system advantage. Narcissists make terrible leaders, yet our era has arranged the stage so they make exceptional candidates. That is the paradox we keep stumbling over and then pretending not to see. The personality that is least fitted to stewardship is perfectly fitted to the audition. Self-regard masquerades as vision. Belligerence performs as strength. Certainty impersonates wisdom. By the time the curtain rises on governing, the casting has already been decided by an audition that rewards glare over light. What makes this possible is not simply the narcissist's hunger for recognition, but the way our public square now manufactures recognition at industrial scale. We have built attention engines that prize the extreme, the immediate, the unembarrassed. In such a marketplace, the person who cannot bear to yield the microphone will always seem more present than the one who pauses to think. The one who treats people as mirrors will always appear more in touch than the one who treats citizens as ends in themselves. The algorithm does not ask who is telling the truth, it asks who is keeping us here. And the narcissist, by instinct, knows how to keep us here. Narcissism also fits the rhythm of perpetual campaigning. When politics becomes an endless season of casting calls, the skills of governing, listening, compromising, absorbing blame, sharing credit, look suspiciously like weakness. The crowd wants a cliffhanger, not a spreadsheet. The donor wants heat, not homework. The media cycle wants a plot twist, not a procurement reform. The narcissist offers a simple bargain. Feed me attention, and I will feed you excitement. It is a bargain that empties institutions while filling headlines. Shame in this economy is no longer a limit, it is fuel. A healthy polity uses shame as a boundary around the common good. Cross the line and you feel it, and you correct course. The narcissist cannot metabolize shame as a signal, so he weaponizes it as a spectacle. Scandal becomes stagecraft. Consequences become content. The capacity to blush, a civic virtue, gets recoded as fragility. The person who refuses to apologize begins to look strong, while the person who admits error appears weak. In that inversion, everything that makes for durable leadership is quietly devalued. Because the narcissist recognizes only the good that redounds to the self, every relationship becomes transactional and every institution becomes expendable. The party is useful until it is not. The court is legitimate until it is not. The law is binding until it is not. Loyalty is the highest good because it is the most easily measured. Are you with me today, in public, without hesitation? Competence, conscience, and dissent cannot survive inside this orbit. They are interpreted as disloyalty even when offered in service of the mission. Over time, the apparatus of governance becomes a hall of mirrors, and the reflection at the center mistakes that glitter for greatness. It is tempting to blame this entirely on character, but character alone does not explain prevalence. Architecture does. We have designed a political economy that outsources patience, penalizes nuance, and monetizes outrage. We have confused virality with mandate and charisma with consent. If we keep confusing applause with consent, the person most skilled at producing applause will continue to rise, regardless of their ability to bear the weight of office. This is not fate, it is configuration. What we reward, we will receive, again and again, until we change what we reward. A final discomfort: narcissists are not imported into our systems like an invasive species. They grow in our soil. They flourish where we are tired of complexity and hungry for catharsis. They flourish where we prefer to be entertained rather than represented, mobilized rather than governed. They flourish where fear is high and memory is short. To name their rise is not merely to diagnose them, but to examine our appetites. The cure begins where the demand ends. And demand ends when a citizenry chooses the long repair over the quick thrill, the quiet competence over the noisy savior, the work of self-government over the romance of spectacle. The pattern of false leadership. False leadership does not arrive as a surprise. It follows a choreography. The opening move is grandiosity. The false leader narrates themselves as the indispensable hinge of history. Only I can fix it. Without me, nothing stands. Gratitude gives way to self-mythology. The story of a people becomes the story of a person, and the vocabulary of service is slowly replaced by the vocabulary of salvation. When a culture accepts this exchange, it lowers its guard against excess, because the hero's appetite begins to masquerade as the nation's need. Spectacle then substitutes for substance. Press conferences multiply while plans thin. Announcements crowd out implementation. Motion is mistaken for progress because it is louder and easier to film. The image of competence, a hard hat, a backdrop of flags, a late-night emergency briefing, begins to count more than the slow, unglamorous labor of making institutions work. As attention becomes the metric, the horizon shortens to whatever the camera can currently see. What cannot be televised is deprioritized. What cannot be simplified is ignored. Limits become enemies. Courts, audits, independent agencies, long-standing norms, anything that says no must be rewritten as obstruction by bad actors. The false leader cannot accept that constraint is the shape of constitutional power, not its negation. So the logic hardens. If you resist, you are disloyal. If you scrutinize, you are subversive. In that atmosphere, the ecosystem that keeps power honest is starved of oxygen, and the public begins to forget the difference between a rule of law and a rule of men. Loyalty replaces law as the basic currency. The inner circle is selected not for judgment but for obedience. Competence is tolerated only when it agrees. Conscience is interpreted as weakness. Dissent becomes treachery. This corrodes governance from within, because the very people needed to transmit hard truths to the top learn that their survival depends on silence. Over time, the administration becomes a hall of mirrors, each reflecting flattery back to the center, until the center mistakes echo for evidence. Failure is not met with repentance, but with revision. Errors are re-narrated as betrayals by others. Broken promises are recast as proof that the system is out to get the leader. Apologies are traded for escalation. The record is not corrected, it is rewritten. This habit injures public memory. If nothing can be admitted, nothing can be learned. If nothing can be learned, the same harms recur, only larger, only costlier, only closer to the bone. Extraction displaces stewardship. Institutions become instruments for private advantage, reputation leveraged for personal gain, access bartered for protection, public resources treated as props. Credit is privatized while risk is socialized, and the long maintenance of the common good is pawned to fund the short thrill of personal brand. What should have been tended is instead consumed, leaving successors with a stripped stage and an audience trained to applaud the wrong things. To keep this edifice upright, crisis must be constant. Emergency is the oxygen of false leadership because it suspends questions, flattens nuance, and justifies improvisation without accountability. If a genuine crisis is not available, a rhetorical one will do. The temperature must stay high so that vigilance stays low. A people perpetually alarmed will accept from a performer what they would reject from a steward, and by the time the fever breaks, the damage is already embedded in the bones of the institutions. None of this requires a mastermind. It requires only a personality hungry for admiration and a public sphere calibrated to feed that hunger. The pattern repeats because the incentives repeat, and it becomes our task as citizens to recognize the choreography early, before admiration hardens into permission, before permission hardens into habit, before habit hardens into harm. How they rise and why we help. False leaders do not levitate into power, they are lifted. They are lifted by architectures that reward noise over judgment, by institutions that confuse heat for mandate, and by a public mood that longs for relief more than it asks for repair. This is the part of the story that hurts the most, because it shifts the gaze from the villain on the stage to the audience in the seats. They rise through us, not merely over us. Fear opens the door first. When the ground feels unsteady, economies lurching, norms fraying, futures dimming, we crave the sedation of certainty. The promise of a single decisive hand feels like oxygen, even when it arrives with a price tag we pretend not to read. Fear blurs the difference between strength and belligerence, between clarity and cruelty. It shortens our horizon to the next relief, and a leader skilled in manufacturing relief can pass for a leader capable of delivering repair. Flattery keeps the door open. The false leader speaks in a mirror, not a window. They reflect our grievances back to us until the reflection feels like recognition, and recognition feels like love. It is easy to mistake the pleasure of being seen for the safety of being served. We are told we are the real ones, the forgotten ones, the righteous core. In that warm bath of affirmation, scrutiny cools. What begins as an appeal to dignity decays into a demand for devotion. Fatigue does the quiet work. Governance at its best is a choreography of trade-offs, dull meetings, long memos, incremental gains that rarely trend. After enough disappointments, the complexity begins to feel like contempt. We grow suspicious of the very patience self-government requires. The false leader offers a balm, a simpler story, a villain with a name, a timetable that fits a news cycle. We accept the simplification because it spares us the ache of ambiguity, and in doing so, we outsource our judgment to the most confident voice in the room. Fog finishes the job. When facts are contested at industrial scale, when platforms monetize outrage and fracture attention, the shared table of reality wobbles. In the haze, the boldest narrative has an advantage over the truest one. Suspicion becomes a mood rather than a method. Everyone's lying, we say, so I'll choose the liar who lies for me. That is how epistemic exhaustion becomes political permission. The very instability that should make us cautious makes us malleable. The bandwagon effect then baptizes what began as theater. Polls become prophecies. Electability replaces ethics as the standard of choice. People want to be on the winning side, and the aura of inevitability is its own campaign. The more cameras point at the performer, the more legitimate the performance appears. We forget that attention is not consent and that virality is not legitimacy. We let momentum do our thinking, and momentum is an indiscriminate god. None of this requires malice on the part of ordinary citizens. It requires time scarcity, economic pressure, the fracturing of community life, and the erosion of local institutions that once taught us how to deliberate together. It requires parties addicted to fundraising heat, media cycles optimized for cliffhangers, and social platforms that reward the very traits we should screen out. It requires, in short, a configuration that makes the worst choice feel like the easiest one. Not a conspiracy, but a design. Not destiny, but drift. There is one more discomfort to name. False leaders thrive on our cynicism as much as on our hope. When we decide that everyone is corrupt, that nothing matters, that the game is rigged beyond recall, we abdicate the small agencies that accumulate into culture. Abstention becomes collusion by another name. The stage does not stay empty when we step away. It fills with whoever most enjoys the lights. If consent is a currency, then indifference is a subsidy, and we have been paying out more than we admit. Their rise, then, is an X-ray of our appetites and our architectures. It tells us what we reward, what we fear, what we are willing to overlook when tired. To reverse the trend, we will have to change both the palate and the plate, the tastes we cultivate as citizens and the systems we build as a people. But before we can do that, we must be honest about how we helped assemble the ladder they climbed. Only from that honesty can we begin the slow work of choosing differently. What leadership actually requires. Before we can reject the counterfeit, we have to name the real. Leadership worthy of a community is not an aura or a mood. It is a set of habits enacted in public, under constraint, for a horizon longer than a news cycle. At its core is accountability, the willingness to be answerable for consequences rather than merely admired for intentions. An accountable leader makes promises that can be measured and welcomes the measurement. They speak in verbs that can be verified and accept that error is not a scandal, but an event to be owned and learned from. The tell is simple. When facts cut against the brand, they adjust the self to the truth rather than the truth to the self. Alongside accountability sits the harder virtue, sacrifice. The office exists to bear costs that would break a private citizen, and a leader who flinches at cost will compensate with performance. Sacrifice is not theatrical self-denial. It is the quiet redistribution of risk from the many to the one. It looks like taking the first pay cut and the last credit. It looks like protecting the unpopular but necessary choice when the polls are cruel. It looks like declining the perks that would compromise judgment, refusing the donors who would purchase access, and stepping aside when one's continued presence would harm the mission. Without sacrifice, every principle becomes negotiable, and every institution becomes a vending machine for personal advancement. Wisdom, backed by integrity, is the third pillar and the one least compatible with spectacle. Wisdom is the capacity to choose under uncertainty without lying about the uncertainty. It knows that means stain ends, that shortcuts leave scars, that the best decision is sometimes the least marketable. Integrity ties those judgments to a moral ballast, so that convenience cannot dress itself up as prudence. Together they produce a style of rule that treats dissent as an instrument rather than an insult, because only a foolish leader prefers flattery to feedback. Where integrity is alive, loyalty is earned by trust, not demanded by threat. Real leadership also accepts limits as formative rather than obstructive. The law is not a wall to climb but a rail to hold when the ground shifts. Independent institutions, rigorous audits, and a free press are not enemies to be managed but partners that keep power from losing its mind. You can tell the difference between a steward and a performer by how they behave when told no. The steward asks whether the no is a guardrail worth heeding and adjusts course. The performer declares a conspiracy and floors the accelerator. Time horizon reveals the rest. A leader who is governing rather than auditioning chooses policies that may not mature in their tenure. They plant trees they will not see in shade, draft procurement reforms that won't earn applause, invest in maintenance that prevents disasters no camera will film. They build for succession, not dependence, and teach their teams to thrive without them. When the story centers on the institution's durability rather than the individual's indispensability, You are in the presence of the real thing. None of this is glamorous. It is slow, repetitive, often thankless work. It resists the dopamine economy and asks something steadier of the citizen: patience for processes that rarely trend, attention to trade-offs that refuse to be simplified, gratitude for competence that produces no cliffhangers. But there is no alternative path that does not end in hollowness. A people that will not reward accountability will be governed by those who master apology theater. A people that will not honor sacrifice will be ruled by appetites with slogans. A people that will not prize wisdom with integrity will be dazzled by certainty without understanding. If we recalibrate our appetites toward these requirements, much of the counterfeit cannot survive the exposure. The false leader's charisma wilts under real constraint. Their certainty dissolves when asked to pick costs rather than enemies. Their movement thins when it is forced to become an institution that outlasts their presence. What leadership actually requires is both plainer and harder than the costume suggests. It asks for a person who can be smaller than the office, so the office can be larger than the person. Practical tests for citizens. We do not need arcane expertise to tell gold from gilded tin. We need habits of attention that ordinary people can practice in ordinary time. Begin with the handback test. Watch what a leader does with powers acquired in emergency or moments of advantage. A steward treats extraordinary authority like a borrowed tool, used sparingly, documented carefully, and returned as soon as the job allows. A performer treats it like a souvenir. If suspensions and shortcuts become permanent furniture, you are not witnessing prudence under pressure, but appetite learning its range. Next comes the test of blame. Failure is inevitable in public life. The question is what story gets told in its wake. A true leader shares responsibility downward and spreads credit outward because their first loyalty is to the mission, not the myth of infallibility. Counterfeits invert the ratio. They hoard triumphs and export errors, rewriting events so that accountability never lands where decisions were made. Over time, this habit teaches an organization to hide truth from itself, and a polity that cannot look itself in the eye eventually stumbles in the dark. Time horizon reveals character in slow motion. Listen for plans that mature beyond a news cycle, beyond an election, even beyond a career. A steward is willing to plant trees whose shade will fall on strangers. They invest in maintenance, standards, and procurement reforms that produce no dramatic headlines because the drama is what didn't happen. The false leader governs for the camera's patience. When the horizon shrinks to a weekend, you can be sure the bill is being mailed to the future. Then consider the test of scarcity. Real governance is the art of trade-offs, choosing which goods to delay so greater goods can survive. Watch whether a leader names costs plainly and accepts the anger that truth attracts, or whether they conjure outcomes that add without subtracting, promising everything while cutting nothing that has a constituency. If every program is essential and every tax is intolerable, you are not hearing strategy, you are hearing sales. Finally, there is the test of truth. When facts cross purposes with identity, does the leader bend the story or bend the self? Integrity shows itself in the willingness to update, to correct the record without dramatics, to let evidence bruise the ego and still remain standing. Grand narratives can survive revision, fragile brands cannot. Where you see consistent public adjustment in the direction of reality, you are in the company of someone building something that might outlast them. Where you see insistence that the world conform to the speech, you are in the presence of performance. Apply these tests quietly, consistently, without the heat of fandom or the haze of disgust. They do not require perfect saints to pass, only adults. And that is the point. Republican life is less a search for saviors than a discipline of discernment. When enough citizens practice it, counterfeit leadership loses the shelter of our confusion. The costs we're already paying. The price of false leadership does not arrive as a single catastrophe. It accrues like rust. Day after day, a little more friction, a little less faith, a little more noise to drown out the quiet work of repair. At first, the damage hides in the seams, in the small delays and the shrugged shoulders, and that's just how it is now. Then one morning, the hinge will not turn, and we act surprised that a door unused to honest force has forgotten how to open. Institutions feel it first. Expertise is recoded as elitism, guardrails as bad manners, norm keepers as obstacles to destiny. The slow disciplines that make public systems resilient, procurement standards, conflict of interest rules, independent audits, are trimmed in the name of agility and then amputated in the name of necessity. What remains is an edifice that still resembles a state from a distance, but behaves, under pressure, like an arena. When the next storm comes, as storms always do, there is more choreography than capacity and more lighting than load-bearing. Trust erodes next. A population learns by watching. If a leader treats truth as negotiable, the lesson travels downstream. Rules are optional for those who can afford the fee. Integrity is costume. Accountability is for the unlucky. People adjust. The honest feel foolish, the cautious feel naive, the ambitious learn the shortcuts. Markets price this cynicism in, communities calcify around it, and public life becomes a contest between outrage and apathy. Both are exhaustions by different names, and both make self-government harder than it needs to be. Policy begins to lurch. Long problems, climate, infrastructure, demographic shifts, public health, cannot be solved on a schedule sized for headlines. Yet the audition never ends, so what passes for governance is a sequence of gestures calibrated to the camera's attention span. Programs arrive with a fanfare and depart with a whimper. Pilots replace plans, pilots replace pilots. Over time, the future is pawned to cash flow the present, and the debt is not only fiscal. It is the debt of opportunity lost, of talent trained to serve theater, of courage redirected toward brand management. The harm is not only structural, it is intimate. Moral injury spreads in workplaces where people are tasked with enacting what they cannot defend or defending what they were not given time to understand. Good professionals, civil servants, teachers, clinicians, officers, learn to swallow what would once have stuck in their throat because the mortgage is real and the children need shoes and resignation feels like surrender. Each compromise may be small, the aggregate is a wound. A culture cannot thrive on the quiet despair of its competent. Reputation bleeds outward. Allies hesitate, investors hedge, partners build contingency plans they did not need before. Words once taken at face value now require footnotes. Promises demand escrows of proof. Soft power, the ability to persuade without coercing, depends on the belief that a community will keep faith with its commitments even when the cameras turn away. False leadership spends that belief like found money, and when it is gone, it is very hard to re-earn. All the while, the social fabric thins. We grow more tribal, more brittle, more certain that the other side has forfeited its claim to good faith. Town halls turn into talk shows, school boards into battlegrounds, houses of worship into safe rooms for the already convinced. The common square shrinks to comment threads where the loudest curate reality for the tired. This is not simply unpleasant, it is disabling. A people that cannot imagine one another cannot plan together, and a people that cannot plan together will be governed by those who profit from disruption. These are the costs we can see. There are others we miss because they show up as absences. The project that was never greenlit, the young public servant who left, the entrepreneur who decided the hassle was not worth the risk, the compromise that could have softened a conflict before it hardened into grievance. False leadership breeds counterfactual tragedies, things that did not happen and now never will, and our accounting rarely includes them. The ledger looks cleaner than the life. By the time the bill arrives in a form that even the distracted must notice, a blackout, a bridge failure, a scandal too big to spin, we search for a villain large enough to carry the blame. There are always villains. But the line that connects them to us runs through the ordinary days when we normalize the abnormal, when we let performance substitute for work, when we chose the sugar high over the steady meal. The costs were charging interest all along. We only heard the knock when it was too loud to ignore. What we can do: design, discipline, dignity. If the problem were merely the personality of a few people, we could swap faces and be done. It is not. What we are facing is a stage that rewards performance over responsibility, and a culture that has learned to enjoy the show. Repair begins when we stop auditioning and start rebuilding the theater. The work is drier than the drama it replaces, but it is also how republics recover, not with a thunderclap, but with a better floor plan. Design is the first movement. Systems are teachers, and ours have been tutoring us in impatience and spectacle. We can design for a different curriculum. That looks like processes that slow decisions just enough for evidence to matter, like rules that separate private advantage from public duty, like visible pathways by which ordinary competence can rise without pledging fealty to a brand. It looks like evaluation that prizes outcomes measured after the cameras leave. It looks like platforms and parties that weight deliberation over volume, that give daylight to budgets and conflicts and influence, that make it easier to see who benefits and how. When the architecture demands receipts, the costume becomes less persuasive. Discipline is the second movement, and it begins in the small radius of our daily attention. The spectacle economy feeds on our outrage and our boredom in equal measure. Starve it. Resist the invitation to share what you have not read, to amplify what you cannot verify, to let your disgust carry more of you than your discernment. Reward correction when you see it, even from those you'd rather dislike. Show up where the work is slow. School boards, neighborhood councils, budget hearings, and practice the unglamorous patience that governance requires. The soil changes when enough of us refuse to be entertained into negligence. Dignity is the third movement, and it is the hardest because it asks for a posture, not a policy. Treat your opponents as citizens, not props in someone else's narrative. Speak about trade-offs without contempt for the people who will bear them. Demand accountability without dehumanization. When leaders model this, institutions stiffen. When citizens model it, the selection environment shifts. Dignity is not softness. It is the insistence that we will not become smaller than the problems we face, that we will not purchase victory at the price of our own corrosion. None of this is fast. The habits that hollowed our commons were learned over years, and unlearning them will feel like swimming upstream. There will be days when the slow path looks foolish beside the immediate thrill of a viral takedown or a theatrical purge. But slow is not the same as weak. In public life, slow is often the other name for durable. The point is not to win the next cycle with cleaner rhetoric. It is to make the next decade less vulnerable to counterfeit charisma because the incentives have been rearranged underneath it. If we redesign what we reward, discipline what we attend to, and dignify how we contend, the oxygen thins for the false leader. The crisis will still come, as crises do, but we will meet it with institutions that remember their purpose, with citizens who remember their agency, and with a politics that has relearned how to choose stewards over performers. That is not a fantasy of purity. It is a program of repair. It is the patient art of making the stage honest again, so that those who step into the light must be equal to it. A word back to Machiavelli. It is tempting to leave Machiavelli at the beginning of this essay where we first met him, as a corrective to our caricatures, and then move on. But he belongs here, near the end, because his challenge is not simply descriptive, it is moral. He wrote about power without perfume so that citizens would stop being surprised by the smell. He understood that republics rot less from a single villain than from the habits of a people who prefer consoling stories to uncomfortable truths. If he has a message for us now, it is not that foxes and lions should be admired, but that they should be recognized early and constrained by design rather than drama. Read this way. The Prince and the Discourses form a single argument about responsibility. One book insists that rulers cannot ignore the world as it is. The other insists that citizens cannot survive if they forget what the world can become under bad rule. Clarity about means does not absolve us of judging ends. It sharpens the judgment. Machiavelli's unsentimental gaze is not a license to be cruel. It is a refusal to be naive. He tells us that fortune favors the prepared, that institutions are scaffolding, not scenery, and that a polity that treats law like a costume will eventually find itself naked when the weather turns. He also warns against the romance of singular saviors. A healthy republic is measured by the sturdiness of its offices, not the charisma of its occupants. If a leader's brilliance is the only thing holding the system together, then nothing is holding the system together. The task, for rulers and ruled alike, is to build arrangements that make virtue easier and vice costlier, to prize procedures that outlast personalities, to honor the boring disciplines that rarely go viral but quietly keep the common house upright. Consent is a currency. Spend it on structures that return compound interest rather than on spectacles that evaporate by morning. The hardest part of his counsel is personal. He asks us to trade innocence for vigilance, to accept that love of country sometimes looks like saying no to those who claim to love it most loudly. He asks leaders to submit to limits that pinch in the short term so that legitimacy can breathe in the long term. He asks citizens to prefer the slow dignity of stewardship to the quick thrill of revenge. None of this is theatrical. All of it is decisive. A people that has learned to see clearly about incentives, about narrative, about the ease with which power flatters and frightens, will not be so easily cast as an audience. If there is a kindness in Machiavelli, it is the kindness of reality. He gives us back the textures of human nature, the friction of institutions, the weather of chance, and then invites us to govern with eyes open. In a time crowded with counterfeit certainties, that is a gift. We do not need to become harder to become wiser. We need to become truer. And the truth is simple enough to say if difficult to live. The health of a republic rests less on the height of its leader than on the honesty of its stage and the seriousness of its citizens. The choice before us. The rise of false leaders is not a twist of fate or a curse from history. It is a readable response to what we reward and what we tolerate. That means it can be rewritten. The choice before us is not between saintly rulers and wicked ones, nor between naive optimism and corrosive cynicism. It is between a politics that treats us as an audience and a politics that asks us to be a people. Audiences wait to be moved. Peoples agree to move together. Audiences demand sensation. Peoples accept the cost of building. Audiences applaud. Peoples amend. To choose well, we will have to recalibrate what feels like strength. The performance of certainty will have to lose its charm so that the labor of judgment can regain its dignity. The glamour of the singular savior will have to dim so that the quieter courage of institutions comes back into view. We will have to decide, again and again, that legitimacy matters more than velocity, that persuasion matters more than domination, that the point of law is not to decorate power but to discipline it. None of this is cinematic. All of it is durable. We will also have to become suspicious of our own appetites, especially the appetite for relief. False leaders sell relief on credit and send the invoice to the future. Responsible leadership sells repair and asks for payment up front. Time, patience, participation, the humility to be wrong in public. If we insist on leaders who never admit error, we will be governed by people who never learn. If we insist on stories with villains but no trade-offs, we will purchase catharsis at the price of competence. The path out is not a better slogan, it is a better tolerance for reality. There is comfort, oddly, in accepting the ordinary scale of our agency. No single election will save us, no single scandal will doom us. Cultures are made in accretions, of choices, of habits, of what we normalize and what we refuse. If consent is a currency, then attention is the mint where it is struck. Spend it with care. Lend it to those who can be smaller than the office, so the office can be larger than them. Withdraw it from those who ask you to hate before they ask you to think. Where enough of us practice that economy, the oxygen thins for counterfeit charisma. The end of this essay is not a flourish, because the work ahead is not theatrical. It is the steady, unglamorous craft of making a stage honest enough that performers cannot survive as rulers, and rulers must learn to serve. It asks more from us than admiration and outrage. It asks for grown-up attention. It asks for patience with processes that rarely trend. It asks for the bravery to be bored by what keeps a common house standing, and to be grateful for it. We can have a politics that grows stewards instead of stars. We can have institutions that remember their purpose and citizens who remember their power. We can learn again to prefer the difficult truth to the flattering story. The choice is not abstract, it is daily, proximate, and ours.